Hello, I'm David Clarke from DaVinci Training, and in this series of videos I'm going to be taking you through a complete edit in DaVinci Resolve. I'm going to be using the free version of Resolve. Now there are two versions. There's a free version and a studio version. The studio version is about £200 and gives you lots of extra effects and does 3D and various other things. There's a chapter at the end of this tutorial that explains a lot of the important differences between the two. But the free version does an awful lot of stuff, and you might find it does everything that you need. So you could just download it and get editing right now. It does need a fairly decent graphics card to work properly, so ideally you want a graphics card that's quite recent and has got 4 or 6 GB or more of RAM, but it does work on some laptop graphics cards. You'll just have to do a lot more rendering. But ideally get a decent graphics card to work it, but the program itself is entirely free. Now you'll know if you've visited my website, I'm a big fan of Edius, which I still use an awful lot, but I do also use Resolve and Premiere, so I thought it was about time I did some Resolve videos as well. Now this entire series will be released on YouTube for free, so over the next few weeks it'll all come out and you'll be able to watch it quite happily, but if you want to, you can get a copy off of my website for £20. It'll be all the videos with a nice front end, so you'll have it on your computer so you can refer to it whenever you want to and find chapters more easily. The content will be the same, so you can wait and just wait for the whole thing to come out on YouTube, or you can head over to my website www.dvctraining.co.uk to get hold of the download version right now. Anyway, time to get on with the edit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume you've just installed Resolve, you've just opened it up. How do you set it up? How do you get your first project going? And how do you get your clips into it? After you've installed Resolve, it asks you some fairly basic questions. So it gives you a list of different things here. You can read any of these. This is just really telling you what's all new in the program. You go past that and it says, do you want to go into a quick setup or do you want to go straight in and start? I'd go through a quick setup because it's fairly quick. First off, it's just check the correct operating system and correct graphics card. Secondly, it says what kind of project would you like to start, as it says here. Choose obviously standard def, high def, ultra definition. This is the important one. Where do you want to store the media? It defaults to the C drive. You really want to change this to somewhere else, because this isn't just where it's going to store any videos that you capture, it's also where it's going to put all the temporary files and things like that. So I would definitely change this to be a different drive. Otherwise your program's drive might fill up and it'll cause you problems. If you've got loads of drives, choose one of them that's quite nice and fast and you've got a bit of space on. And I generally create a folder, select that and go continue. Final question is, do you want to go with the standard Resolve keyboard shortcuts or some keyboard shortcuts from something else? So suppose you've been using Premiere, maybe you'll want to use this because it'll make Resolve use the same keyboard shortcuts as Premiere for all the things that are similar. I personally leave it at Resolve, just learn new keyboard shortcuts. Click continue and you're ready to get into Resolve. Now if you skip it, it'll just automatically set it to be the C drive and you'll have to change it later on. But I'd always want to change it because if you leave stuff going on the C drive, it might fill up and then your computer won't work properly. As you can see here, I'm using the free version, not the studio version of Resolve. And there's a lot of nice things in the studio version, I do own it, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I thought I'd just go through the free one. And you're into Resolve. So you can see here you've got the main interface. It's all on one screen at the moment. I do have 2 screens on this computer and I could spread it out over 2 if I wanted to. Down the bottom here, you've got all the main pages. So it's gone straight to the cut page, which is a page for editing video. There's another one for editing video, which is called Edit. I tend to use Edit because I'm used to using things like Premiere and Edius, and the Edit page works pretty much a lot like that. The idea of the cut page is it gives you a quick way of editing. But I think if you're coming for another program, you're probably best to start off with the Edit page and then learn the cut page later on. You've got the Media page, which is where you can bring stuff in. The Fusion page, which is sort of an equivalent to After Effects. It's a fancy compositing program that you can use inside of it. The color page, which is specifically for grading. The Fairlight page, which is all to do with advanced audio editing. And finally the Deliver page, which is all for exporting. Now what I'm going to do is show you how to get through a basic edit in Resolve. So probably I won't be going to the Fusion, the color or the Fairlight page at all. And I'll be concentrating on the Edit page, Media page and then finally getting stuff out. And that's one of the things about Resolve. There's so much in it that you can actually ignore complete sections of the program and still do everything you want quite happily. Now, before I carry on, there's a couple of settings that I would like to go through. There are a couple of different places where you can get to settings. So if you go up to the words DaVinci Resolve here, there's some preferences that you can get to. And also down here, there's this little cog that you can get to. These preferences are kind of preferences for the entire program, whereas the ones on the cog are really to do with this specific project. Obviously, once you open it up, there's lots of other things. So before I get into editing, I just wanted to point out a couple of things I would always change. First of all, come up to Resolve and then Preferences. Here you have two lots, System and User. Under System, the first thing you can see is it shows up here where the media is stored. So there it's got D-Resolve. That's the directory that I just set up as the default media directory. So if you hadn't done that, you could just come in here and add one, choose another directory, and then you could change from the C drive to the D drive. But I'd always make sure at least that one there, which is where all your temporary files are going to get created, is not on your main hard drive. You can add in other drives here if you want. So once that's filled up, it'll just pop onto another one for its stuff in the background. Actually, most of the stuff you're using in it will be clips that you've already copied onto the computer in some other way. So this is really just for your temporary files and renders and things like that. The video and audio I/O here, if you have got a video device inside the machine, this is where you can set it up so you can watch the picture out to a television. Inside this system, I have got an Intensity Pro. It's actually a really old-fashioned Intensity Pro. Now to enable it, you come up to the preferences, you go to Video and Audio I/O, and you choose the Intensity Pro as the monitor device. I can also choose it as the capture device if I want to. Have to admit, I very rarely capture things through Resolve. I mean, I very rarely capture things at all now, but the capturing in Resolve is fairly basic, doesn't do things like DV footage, you can only do analog footage through the Blackmagic cards. That's how you'd enable it as a capture device. This is how you'd enable it to actually monitor the timeline. Now, once you've set it and you come out of it, it's going to say, oh, right, this won't take effect until you restart Resolve. So I'd have to turn off Resolve and start it again. This sets the picture. This sets the sound. So generally, I do leave it on system audio. Now, if you're used to a program like Edius and you're using a Blackmagic card, you'll notice that when you're using the Blackmagic card, the sound comes out through the Blackmagic card as well. They do that to make sure you don't have any audio sync problems, because if you've got the picture coming out the Blackmagic and the sound coming out of the sound card, vaguely possible they might be out of sync. As a default, Resolve will just get the picture popping out of there and the sound popping out of the sound card. Generally works for me, haven't really noticed any sync problems, but if you do, pop over there and choose Desktop Video, and now what's going to happen is the sound will come out of your Blackmagic device and the picture will come out of your Blackmagic device. Now that does mean if you haven't got any speakers plugged into it, you suddenly won't hear anything. You'll only hear it through the television that it's attached to. What I tend to do is to take the sound output from the Blackmagic and loop it back into the line in on the sound card, or have two sets of speakers. But generally I don't do that because I've left it on system audio and actually I haven't noticed any sync issues. Other little tick box I do with hardware is this one, release video device when not in focus. If I tick that, when I'm in Resolve, Blackmagic is outputting the picture from the timeline. If I minimize Resolve, then the Blackmagic stops outputting the picture from the timeline and I can pop into Edius or I can pop into Premiere or After Effects and I can use the Blackmagic in the other programs. If that is not ticked, then when I minimize Resolve, the Blackmagic is still being used by Resolve and nothing else can touch it. So I couldn't go into Edius or I couldn't go into After Effects and see my After Effects output through the Blackmagic device. If I turned off Resolve, I could. So it's not a biggie, but I like to tick it because then I can use it in other programs. The main one is that. Tick that and then you can see a picture out of it. What's coming out of it will depend on your project settings. So let's go to the little cog here and it'll be this thing here, video format. Generally it matches your timeline format, but it doesn't have to. So for example, if I was to change this to 4K, it still shows me HD out of the video gizmo, and I'd have to pop into here and choose the right kind of output out of the video gizmo, which in this case will be 4K at 25p, which my poor little old-fashioned Intensity Pro won't do, so I won't get a picture. Which is one of the reasons I might leave that at 1080 25p, so at least I'll see an HD picture out of my old-fashioned Intensity Pro, even though I'm in a 4K timeline. But that's where you decide what's coming out. And this is also where if you have got an old-fashioned screen and it doesn't even do proper 25p, then you could choose 25p PSF, progressive segmented frames, if you want to know what PSF means. But a lot of old-fashioned screens could not do a proper 25p. So you'd actually have to set it to something else so you can get at least a picture, even if it's not proper 25p. That's what that is. The main thing is that's what the video output's going to be, and you don't get video output from a Blackmagic unless it's selected here. All this stuff you can cheerfully ignore. They're all useful things, but you don't need to know them when you're starting out. And this advanced settings here, you can actually type stuff in if you know what you're doing and configure stuff inside the program. And again, you don't really need to fiddle with that. On the user settings, again, most of this you can get away with not knowing much about. What I would do though is I would come to the project save and load, and I would tick live save, which is ticked by default. Live save is basically where it saves the project every second or so. If it crashes, it'll remember everything up to that point. So it's worth having that on. Project backups is worth ticking as well. It'll back up the project every so often. When it does that, you'll see the program hesitate for a second, but I like project backups. If something goes wrong, you can load them up and get back to where you were a bit earlier on. The project backup location, you notice it's set to be my D drive, that folder that I made up. And this can get quite big. On a machine that I've been using for 3 or 4 months, that's got up to be about 12 gigabytes. So it can get quite big, so I like to keep it off the C drive. And obviously here you can change how often it does it. It's pretty obvious what it all says there. I leave it under defaults. The rest of the stuff, again, you can leave all this as it is. Personally, I like to tick Smart Bin for timelines, which I'll explain a bit more when we come to the editing. But the only really important thing I'd make sure I set up is that. And I'd make sure that the media storage is set so it's not on my programs drive. And if I've got a Blackmagic device, I'd have that set here. Now I'm ready to edit. The interface in Resolve is all one big window, and as you make one thing bigger, the other one gets smaller. But you can't pick things up and move them around. So for example, I can't take that player and just put it over there. I can do things like turn bits off. So where it says media storage here, that's this bit. I click on that, it turns it off, and everything moves across. And with something like this window at the side here, you've got this little drop down there, and if you click on that, it gets bigger and fills the entire side of the screen, and everything else moves across to fit. If you go, say, to the edit page here, now I've got nothing in here at the moment, but there is this thing called the inspector. Now once we get into editing, you'll see you can do all sorts of stuff with clips on that. And on the inspector, you can click this little drop down and it'll fill the whole screen and make the timeline smaller. And I can change the media pool, which is effectively the project window, just by doing that. But I can't pick up things and move them around. I can spread stuff over 2 screens, so you go to Workspace, Dual Screen, and you turn it on. And now I've got 2 screens full of stuff. Now obviously you can only see one on the video here. But again, I can't pick up something from this other screen and make it come over here. The biggest thing I've possibly got is that you could come over here and say make a full screen timeline. So this timeline now is only at the bottom here. If I go to full screen timeline, now I've got the timeline entirely on this screen and everything else on the other screen. To move these things around, again, I can't pick up what's on my second screen and move it here. But what I can do is come up to Workspace, Primary Display, and change which is the primary display. See, that's moved them around. So now my full screen timeline is on the screen that you can't see, together with all the menus, and my player windows and effects and things, they're all over here. Now I'm going to put the primary display back to the first screen, which I had to do on a menu you couldn't see, and I'm going to turn off dual screen, just because obviously I'm only filming one for the purpose of the tutorial. But the only thing you can do is inside the media pool. Now the media pool is what they call the project window. I can come up to these little dots here, so if you see little dots, there's a menu. Come up to those little dots and say dual pane window, and it will show me 2 windows. With all these different tabs down here, I'm going to really concentrate on Media, Edit and Deliver. I can actually turn the others off just to clean up this menu. You come up to Workspace and then Show Page, and if I untick Cut, it no longer appears down there. Untick Fusion, untick Fairlight. Those are really the ones I'm going to be fiddling with. I still can get to the others just by going to Workspace and saying Switch to the Cut page, or using the keyboard shortcut for it, so they don't disappear, it's just they're not being seen anymore. I'm going to turn them all back on. So the fact that you can't move things around as you like is slightly limiting. One nice thing you get if you go for the studio version is up here under Workspace, there's another setting which says Video Clean Feed. Now if you tick that, one of your monitors will become a full screen playback window. In the free version, which is the one I'm using here, you don't have that as an option. That's something you have to pay for. What you can do in the free version is you can output the picture from Resolve using a Blackmagic card to be full screen on television. So you can still do it, but you have to have the Blackmagic card. And having a Blackmagic card is better than using a computer display because it will be a proper video signal. It's just in the studio version, you do have that option of converting one of the screens into a full screen display. Now, before we start editing something, I want to really talk about the project settings. You notice when we started up Resolve and we got into what they call the project manager, which is this thing, and I made up a new project, it doesn't ask you for any settings at any point. So what are the settings of this project? The way Resolve works is that when you drop your first clip into the project, it will ask you if you want the settings to match that. And generally you want to get the project settings right. It is possible to have timelines of different settings inside the same project. So if you did start the wrong one, you could start the right kind of timeline and then just copy stuff over to it. And you can also copy stuff between projects. So if you have two projects, you can right click on here and say dynamic project switching, and then you can actually have two projects open. But at the moment, I don't know what the settings are for this project. I can find out by going down to this little cog here, which is project settings. And here it tells me, okay, the resolution of the timeline is high definition. It's 24 frames a second. It uses 24 frames a second because that's film frame rate, and Resolve started as a thing to grade feature films. But obviously you can change it. As soon as I load a clip up, that's going to get set in stone. So I generally load clips up by going to the media storage, finding the files on the hard drive, and then just dragging them in. Just drag this clip of me in. Now it's initially saying, oh, do you want to change the project frame rate? Because obviously my clips here are not what I've set in the timeline. These happen to be 50p clips. So it's asking, do I want to change that to 50p? Now if I say don't change, it will stay at 25. If I say that, it will change it to 50. And generally you're going to want the timeline to match your clips. So if I do that, now my project is still 25 frames a second, but I've got a 50 frames a second clip in it. If I undo it and do it again and say change it, I've got a 50 frames a second clip in there, and you can see my timeline here has changed to 50 frames a second. If I then put this onto a timeline, so to get that clip onto a timeline, the simplest way is go to the Edit tab and just drag it onto the timeline. Let's turn off the dual pane media phone. And I'm now going to save the project. Now I've put that onto a timeline. If I go back to the project settings, you can see that the frames per second is actually grayed out. So I can't change that anymore. I could change the project size, change the playback rate. I mean, the timeline might be 50 frames a second, but if I say let's play that back at 25 frames a second, it'll start playing back slower. Kind of stupid. You probably never want to do that because that's only affecting the playback. But that basic project frame rate is now set. Even though I've done that, I could actually come in here and make up a new timeline. So I can either right click on a blank space and say create new, or go to file, new timeline. And when you create a new timeline here, obviously you can give it a name. You can tell it to use the project settings, so it'll just be the same as everything else. Or you can untick that and come in here and make up a timeline which is something different. So let me make up a timeline which is 25 frames a second. So I've got the size, I've got the frame rate, whether it's interlaced or not. The monitor resolution, so this is if you're watching it through a Blackmagic, what is outputting through the Blackmagic, and what you're likely to want to make at the end of it. Now I've done that and I've made a second timeline here, and I could put that on there, and that should now be playing at 25 frames a second, even though my main project settings are 50. So it is possible to have both. Suppose I wanted to do an interlaced version of this. Maybe I'm going to make a Blu-ray with it. Now, of course, I can't actually make a Blu-ray with Resolve, but I could edit it in Resolve, export a file, which then something else could convert into Blu-ray. Well, I could say, oh, let's create a new timeline. Let's call it. Untick the Use Project Settings. Go to the format. Let's put it at 25 frames a second and tick the Enable Interlaced box. You notice when I tick that, it's gone to 50 fields per second, because there are 50 half pictures a second in an interlaced timeline. And I'm going to do that. And then I can either grab the clip that I've already put in there, or I could go to one of the other timelines, like timeline number 1. Control A to select everything. Control C to copy. Go back to the interlaced timeline and paste it. And now you can see I've now got my 50p clip on an interlaced timeline. And then if I wanted to, I could make something interlaced out of it for Blu-ray. So it doesn't matter if you get that wrong in the first place. That 50 is still set, but my particular timeline here, it's still playing at 25 frames a second. It's interlaced and it'll look interlaced on an output. So it's possible. What is bad is if you were to make up a new project and then say maybe bring in some kind of still image. So let's bring in a bunch of those because I'm making up a still sequence. Pop to the edit tab, drop them onto the timeline, save it. Now because they're stills, what has Resolve set the project setting to? Well, let's set it to 24. And playback rate's 24. It's now locked at that. Does mean that any new timelines you make, they're automatically going to be 24. Now, like I said, it's not the end of the world because I could just make up a new timeline and untick that and make it 25 instead, but it would be much nicer if it was set to what I'd like it to be. So what I tend to do for new projects, I tend to set up a new project, choose the particular setting I want. Generally these days I'm doing stuff at either 25 if it's home stuff, because I'm generally filming at 25 frames a second, or if say it's something like this tutorial, it's 30 frames a second, but I'll set that up. Then I'll save it, and then I'll go and bring some stuff in, say don't change it, and now I know that I'm at the right basic settings, so any new timelines I make up will still be those settings without me having to faff. If I come in here and try and make up a new timeline, it's automatically set to 25, which is what I'm using all the time. So I like to get it right first, but it isn't the end of the world. Another thing you can do in the settings here is if you've got some particular settings that you like, so suppose I say, right, my timeline's set here for 25 frames a second. Yep, happy with that. My video monitoring, so pretend I've got a Blackmagic card in here. I want to monitor that at a proper 25p. And I set a few of these other things up. Again, won't go through all these in depth, but you can change some of these basic settings, like maybe I want my slow motion to be in frame blending, anything like that. Then I can come up to presets and say save as and give it a name. So now that's saved me a project preset, which I can load in future projects, or if I right click on it, I can say save it as the default. So now what'll happen is when I come into this and make up a new project, check the settings. Oh, it's set to 25p. It's got the output format set that I like. It's got slow motion set to frame blending, all that kind of stuff. I can make that the default for all future projects. Obviously, if you're doing 4K projects, then you would come in here and you would select 4K, which is probably going to be that one, which is the 4K that we generally film on most video cameras. You can go to higher resolutions and you can set your own up, but in the free one, you can't go higher than 4K. The other thing about projects is where are they? Because if you're used to any other program, you'll make up a new project and it'll be a file somewhere on your hard drive. I generally tell people that they should make up a folder. They put everything they need for the project in that folder, and that includes the project itself. But where is it? You know, all my clips here are on my D drive, but where's the project? Resolve stores its projects in a different way to most other programs, and they're all in a database. You can go looking for it if you want to. So if I go to the C drive, users, the name of the current user, application data, roaming, Blackmagic, support, Resolve disk database, Resolve projects, users, guest, projects. And those are the projects that I have made so far. You can do that, grab these and take them out and use them if you want to. Not the best way to do it, but that's where they are. Some of these folders will possibly be hidden inside of your Windows, and you might have to come up to the options. Now I'm obviously on Windows 11 here, but it's a similar kind of look for Windows 10. And make sure you can show hidden files and folders. But that is where the projects are. But I generally don't manage my projects like that. Instead, I do it entirely from the project manager. Now with the project manager, you can see you've got local projects. That means projects that are on your computer. Network projects, in other words, projects that are somewhere else on your network, which if you're working on your own, you won't have. And cloud projects. Particularly in Resolve 18, they've got this thing where you can collaborate with other people via the internet and save your projects on the cloud, so you're all sharing a project. Obviously, I'm on local projects at the moment. And here you can see I've got my different projects here. And if I wanted to make a backup of that project, I would right click on it and say export project. Find somewhere to stick it and save it. Then if I wanted to take that onto another computer and load it up, I would right click in the project manager and say import project and find it. and it would then import it. Now it won't let me import it here because obviously there's one already with that name, so I've got to give it a different name. But if this was a different computer and it wasn't there, that's the way of doing it. Export it from here, import it somewhere else. Or if you just want to archive it, export it, and then you've got the project file somewhere else other than the C drive. Now I tend to do that quite a bit when I'm editing. I tend to do that at the end of every editing session, so I've got a backup of the project somewhere else. You might remember when I first started up, I did go into the preferences, and under the user settings and project save, I also enabled this, project backups. So it has been making backups on my D drive in here. But yeah, I mean, you look at those and you won't know what on earth you are looking at. You don't ever fiddle with these things. Again, you fiddle with all these through the project manager. I have got backups of my project because I set that up, and they're on a different drive. So if my C drive dies, I have got a backup which I can use. Or I do what I did a minute ago and I just export it to another drive. What I tend to do, like I say, I tend to actually take that and I'll export it to a OneDrive folder, and then it'll get uploaded to the cloud somewhere, so I've got a backup somewhere completely off my computer. If you leave Resolve at the defaults, it'll make your projects up on the C drive and it'll make your backups on the C drive. And if your C drive dies, you've lost your project completely and you have to start editing again. You won't have lost your clips because they'll be somewhere else, but you'll have lost the project. That's why I do that from time to time. Make sure I've got a backup. Or again, if I want to go from one machine to another, export it, import it on the other machine. You can see here when I right click, I can also go to project backups, and then it says, oh, these are the backups you've got. What do you want to restore? Well, there's only one backup. But if you've been using this for ages, you have lots of different ones, and then you can choose a backup from a particular time and load it and hopefully get back something that you've lost. The other thing with projects here is I can delete them and move them and rename them. But the other thing worth mentioning is being able to have two projects open at once, which I vaguely mentioned earlier on. If I right click here and say dynamic project switching, nothing immediately has changed. But suppose I load up my Resolve tutorial project. This thing above the timeline here, and I haven't really spoken very much about anything going on here, but this thing above the timeline here has added in a new option. It says Resolve tutorial, but if I click on that, you can see the other project that I had open in the first place. And I can actually pop between two different projects like this. And I can even select a whole bunch of stuff, like stuff in the bin or stuff on the timeline. And if I copy it, Control C, go into the other one and then paste it, you'll see those other timelines and clips have all come into this project. So it is possible to go between two projects like that. And they've also got other fancy things like smart bins where you can share stuff between different projects. But I'm not going to go into that very much. Literally, I'm going to be talking about basic editing. So maybe I'll do another tutorial on that at some point. Right now, I just want to talk a little bit about projects, where they are and how you get them out of the machine, because that kind of is important. It is different to every other program. So what I'm going to do now is turn off the dynamic project switching, because obviously you're using up much more memory by having two open. And I'm just going to stick on the one project. And I'm going to get rid of this and get rid of these and start from scratch with a clean project.